I really, really wanted to love this movie. And honestly, in a way, and on a personal level, I did. The effects were incredible. The acting and the cast was amazing. And overall, it was a faithful adaptation, servicing and giving the fans exactly what they had been wanting. Seeing Dune become a high budget, high production value, amazing cast with a killer score is something every fan of Dune has been asking for. But taking an outsider perspective and looking at it with a little bit more of a critical eye, there was some problems. Even though Paul is our main protagonist of the story, there are two very clear acts to the movie. The first act being before Leto's death and after. Specifically for this first part, I want to focus on Leto, Paul's father, Jessica's husband, as his death and the thwarting of House Atreides appear to be the build to the eventual climax of the first act. And also, for all intents and purposes, I've always seen Leto as being the protagonist of Act 1 that then lets Paul be the Act 2 protagonist, even though Paul is our overarching main character. And for those of you that are familiar with me, which many of you may not be, I love being given a reason to care about the characters and see those characters that we care about change in some sort of way. A concept or compelling plot might get us in the door, but the reason why we stay and why a story will matter to us will be the experience that we have with those characters. They are what are going to make us stick around. And this is why stories matter. It's the emotional connection that we can create that is stronger than any plot, the impressive world, and oftentimes the reason why theme will resonate so well. Caring about the people in the story is at the heart of building empathy and keeping a reader, or viewer in this case, invested in the story that you're telling. The goal of the storyteller is to make the receiver or the consumer feel something. And the most effective way we can do that is through the experiences of our characters. Plots and concepts are important, especially in the science fiction genre, but one criticism that I've always had and always held, and why I typically don't like many of the classics of the sci-fi genre, is due to the fact that they are very heavy when it comes to plot and concept, while having underdeveloped and paper-thin characters. Dune, on the other hand, was different in that regard. Frank Herbert not only created a believable world with interesting technologies and philosophical predictions of what the future might look like or could be, but he also drafted characters that popped from the page and were filled with agency. HBO's Dune Part 1 really seemed to lack in that regard. It felt as if they packed the cast and wanted us to care about those characters because of the actors that they casted, and not necessarily the characters that they were playing. Similarly, it felt that there was a sacrifice made for the overall character development and character development moments to be in the shadow of impressive effects or dramatic plot points. As a quick aside, I don't remember who said it or where I heard it from, but someone had said that watching Dune was like watching a 2.5 hour preview of Dune. This is, of course, an exaggeration, but I still think the sentiment holds up to some degree. Dune has always been a story that had its cast front and center. Frank Herbert has even gone on to say that the whole point, or the whole theme that was Dune, is all about the pitfalls of charismatic leaders.
Don't trust leaders to always be right. I worked to create a leader in this book who would be really an attractive, charismatic person for all the good reasons, not for any bad reasons. Then power comes to him. He makes decisions. Some of his decisions made for millions of people, millions upon millions of people, don't work out too well.
Though none of that seems to come up, and there seemed to be no charisma at all in our main cast, at least. And going back to focus on the first half of the story, Oscar Isaac is a fantastic actor, but his character, Leto, had little to no investment in him. Arguably the first half of the whole story, he plays one of the most important roles. The killing of the Duke is really the building up to point, and then sets off the entire rest of the story, ushering in Paul as our new front and center protagonist. And up until this point, Leto, in a certain way, really is a protagonist, and yet we are given very little investment into him. We don't know how he feels about Paul, about Jessica. We're given no insight in the film about him as a character. If we compare a similar archetype or a similar character that kind of followed the same plot path and arc in general, we can look at Game of Thrones' Ned Stark. Leto is in many ways Ned Stark, or Ned Stark is in many ways Leto. Both are portrayed as these benevolent rulers, honorable and fatherly in both the source material as well as on screen. Both of them came into power by way of it being bestowed upon them, and both were killed in acts of betrayal, setting off major plot points for the rest of the story. Perhaps if they had more time, they might have been able to build more of an interest and investment into the Duke. But again, this movie was almost 3 hours long, and there's no reason for me to sit here and try and reconstruct the film or be an armchair director. But there is still a stark difference that we can look at as creators ourselves in the difference between these two characters and their arc. The shock and horror of Ned Stark being betrayed and killed towers over Leto's. When Leto is betrayed, and then when he sacrifices himself, it feels as if it was just a passable plot beat. Something scientific that just sort of needed to happen to keep the plot moving forward. Within our own writing, we want there to be emotional weight to a character's decisions. There should be thematic resonance throughout each scene, making us care about a primary character's death or the finality of that character shouldn't be reliant on their final moment. It should be the culmination and the buildup of everything else, and of how your other characters feel about that character. It is the relationships they have with these other characters and the reactions of those other characters that will help your reader or viewer emotionally relate to their loss. A science fiction space opera filled with political intrigue needs to have powerful characters that are pitted against each other. I don't think there was enough character development given to the cast, making this major plot beat just underwhelming. And even leading up to this meaningful plot scene and important moment where Leto sacrifices himself, I don't even think that there was a meaningful moment that we ever saw between him and Jessica and Paul. Most of the scenes that involve all three of them, or even the different pairs of them, they are mostly looking stoic or delivering a dramatic line or two. We don't really have a sense of what Leto stands for, making the sacrifice that he made and that character's eventual death appear unimportant and underwhelming. Taking a step away from the characters for a moment, there was a bit of another issue that may or may not relate to other writers out there. When I first watched the film, I did so with my wife. She had never seen any of the prior adaptations, and she had never read any of the books. But she was familiar with them, had heard of the story in the series, as I brought it up in the past and discussed it before. She got the gist. Watching the film went about the way that you might have expected it. The 2 hour and 35-minute film took us over 3 hours to finish, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the reason why it took so long to finish was because we were always stopping and asking, who is that? What was that? I don't get it. Now, this isn't because my wife and I were like doom scrolling or were distracted or uninterested. It was quite the opposite, in fact. The unfortunate part was that she was genuinely interested and wanted to just know what was going on, who was who, and why specific things were happening and not really being explained. In a complex world that's so foreign to our own, establishing the fundamentals of the setting often helps with immersion and buy-in. Science fiction is probably the only genre that really struggles with this, more so than any other genres. And Dune is really no different. But the film was made for fans of Dune. There's very little explanation for some pretty major elements. All of that is even despite what I saw was some of the best subtle world building I've seen. As an example, by the time Paul meets with the Bene Gesserit and we have the whole Ganjabar box scene, we aren't even that invested in Paul as a character. We haven't even been offered a sliver of the context around the Bene Gesserit as to who or what they are and why he is being tested. We've seen little bits of him But we don't yet know why we care, or we don't know what the stakes are. We only know it is important because we are told and not shown. And we have no context of the Bene Gesserit and don't understand what the mother's connection is to their association until much later. There's also nothing really offered about Paul that makes him a character that we want to be invested in. We need to remember to answer the question, why should the audience care about who is on the screen? There felt as if there was this disconnect between the information we were being provided and the order in which it was being received. Often we were introduced to an element of the story or the world, and then the explanation came 1 or 2 or 3 scenes later. Perhaps the writers were encouraging audience members to rewatch, but I think that these things can often be looked past or even understood if we have that emotional buy-in to the character. If we care about the characters, we're a lot more likely to suspend our disbelief and buy into whatever concepts there are on screen. The audience can forgive you and suspend their disbelief, but you need to give them a reason to do so. What felt like a common theme throughout the film was screen time being dedicated to vague visions and even confusing plot points, at least those unfamiliar with the story, as opposed to offering scenes to establish our characters and make us feel invested in them. Dune tried to balance its foreshadowing, visions, world building, and dramatic plot points, while not really giving us any insight into our characters. When Paul and his mother flee to the desert and he starts having these visions in a tent, we are given a montage of prophecy and futures that could be. Despite this creating a good point of conflict between Paul and his mother, we have been given these visions time and time again with no real payoff. If this would have been a mini-series, which I think would have been the best way to adapt Dune, or something in which we can see the payoff of all this foreshadowing, perhaps might have been more effective. But seeing as this was a film, most people who were watching part 1 and then going and watching part 2 X amount of years later will likely have forgotten some of these visions and prophecies and scenes. So it kind of asks, what good and what purpose do these give if there's no real finality in part 1? Now, I will say, from the reader perspective and someone that's familiar with the genre and the story in general, the film did an excellent job of depicting these visions of all of the different possible futures that could be and will be. And this does answer a primary theme of the story in general, being the existence of free will or predetermined destiny. But again, I only know this because of my familiarity with the story in general and having read the books. I know the lore and the backstory and the meaning behind a lot of these elements. To an outsider, all of these visions likely come off as confusing and might even take away time that could have been spent on building an emotional investment in Paul, his mother, and his father. And again, all throughout the first half of this movie, we are overloaded with concepts and vague scenes with Paul, while nothing is given to him and his father. We can again compare the killing of the Duke in this film to the killing of Ned Stark in Game of Thrones. One of these by far was more effective than the other, due to the character development and the relationships built on screen between the character being killed and the other characters around them. And when it comes to Paul, we need to have some sort of conflict and baseline of who this character is and what they want. There was a missed opportunity here to deviate and diverge from the source material and further develop Paul beyond just his standard Messiah arc. How interesting would it have been to have been given some bit of conflict between his mother's plans for him and what his father might have wanted. We don't really see these two interact, Paul's mother and father, that is. The main point I'm getting at here is that we need to establish the relationships amongst our characters, not be told to just have a relationship with them because. The reader or viewer need to spend enough time with them, getting to know them and understand their beliefs, seeing what their backstory is, and understanding the personality of that character in order to develop empathy for them. We need to ask and we need to answer the question, why does the reader care about this person? A great part of playing the outsider trope is that we, the audience, get to experience this new world through our protagonist's eyes. We are on the same page as them, and they are on the same page as us. But we're given very little insight into what the Duke thinks of this planet and what his plans of reform are. We see him giving a few speeches that might signal he's some sort of benevolent ruler, and we also follow them along when they check out some of the spice refining and spice collectors. But we're given no real insight into what he thinks or feels, besides him saying, "Desert power," which I don't think is that memey of a line to say. The line itself is fine and is said throughout the books and has meaning and whatnot behind it. But that is kind of the extent of what we get to know about how he feels about living on Arrakis. And the same goes for Paul. Even though we see wonder in his eyes and might even connect some of the visions he's seeing to when he ventures out into the desert for the first time, there is no real connection or reflection points to these scenes. We don't really get any insight into his thoughts and feelings about what is going on around him. There's no response to the actions taking place. Now, one thing I think the film did a very good job at was the subtle world building around Paul and through Paul's limited point of view. We see him watching clips about the Fremen traversing the desert and a few other audio sound bites that come up here and there. And even though we, the viewer, got to learn with Paul about these things, we never really knew how he thought or felt about them. He was a very silent protagonist, a very archetypal Messiah type, being stoic and almost brooding, which I think is really a missed opportunity. We, the audience, should have some sort of understanding of the wants and the needs and the desires of these characters to an extent. And especially, or more of an extent, on our main protagonists. The reader or viewer should at least have a baseline understanding of what these might be for our characters, and see them as even reflection points within the plot and the themes of our story. A thematically compelling character is a character the reader and viewer can relate to. And when it comes to relating to an outsider, and these outsiders in this story, it was hard to do so, which normally I love the outsider trope, but nothing really seemed to change about their life and impact the way that they live between Dune and their home world, besides just the backdrop changing. And looking at some of the main themes of Dune and the themes that are present within Dune, we have one of them being stated from Frank Herbert is a warning to not follow charismatic leaders. Now, the film doesn't have to follow the themes of the books or the author had originally intended, but if we were to analyze the themes of the film, what would we walk away with? Is the themes of the film more so related to the imperial nature and the innocent bystanders that get caught up between massive warring factions or family houses? If that was the case, that wasn't really a good portrayal either, seeing as we hardly got a feel for the Fremen and who they are, what their customs were, and how these people interact in this world. But perhaps it actually is about the argument between free will and destiny, given Paul's visions and whatnot. But to that point, do we really care? Have we become invested in Paul and the outcome and what these visions mean and are? And this sort of segues into that Messiah trope that Paul kind of is following. And this trope, the Messiah arc, is very common in fantasy and science fiction, which isn't really a bad thing. Even though the trope's been used a lot, it doesn't mean that you can't use that trope. It just means that there's more effort that needs to be done to make that trope feel fulfilling and not rehashed. But perhaps there's too much of the story leaning into this Messiah archetype. And although Dune is kind of the grandfather of the Messiah archetype, Messiah trope in general, it still is something we've all seen before at this point. Next to the other characters in the cast, Paul just kind of felt a little bit flat, which should have given way to some of the creative liberties that the film could have depicted. And this could make us care more about that overused trope and see beyond it and get a peek into what makes Paul Paul. And the reasons why viewers and readers are critical of that Messiah trope is because in the past, we've been commonly just told to care about this character because of their arc, rather than showing why we should care about this character and their arc. The biggest missed opportunity was to make Paul a truly sympathetic and charismatic Messiah. And that may come later on, but in the purpose of the first film, we didn't get a feel at all of who Paul is and what Paul cares about. There's no context given for his wants, his needs, and his desires. He just sort of is. we never really saw the evolution of him becoming. There are some small moments of him training and when he's learning to use the voice, but in the entirety of the movie, this makes up 2 to 3, maybe 4 scenes, which most of them happen at the very start. And I'm not trying to be nitpicky, but these felt like boxes that just needed to be ticked, instead of key points in developing Paul's character. And I am going to pull the book to movie card really quickly here, but hopefully just this once. A major portion of the book is kind of omitted, though I don't know why. At the very end of part 1, and this might be a little bit spoilery, but if they intend to include this in part 2, but at the very end of part 1 of the book, which is the end of part 1 of the movie, when Paul wins the duel, he cries for the man that he killed. And when Paul cries, the Fremen are amazed by the sacrifice of water for Jameis. In awe, they say Paul has given moisture to the dead. In their culture, this is a profound sign of mourning, since water is so precious. And again, this doesn't happen immediately after the duel in the books. It happens during a funeral scene following it. But the book does end with them traversing through the desert, and the closure of that scene and this reaction takes away from its effect and the power that it might have had. It appears as though this might be in part 2, which does play a key role in the Fremen accepting Paul as their messiah. But this does sort of take away from the effect of the duel and its outcome. We're given a scene or an action, and the effect is seen a year or 2 later. And if this does happen in part 2, that is fine. But we should remember that each of these parts should stand on their own and not rely on a loyal fan base to pick up for the lack of character development and resonance for a story. Dune Part 1 was incredibly faithful to the source material, showing respect for some very specific details and elements, except shied away from some of the character development that should have taken place. It fell flat for making an emotional bond between the audience and the characters on the screen. And instead of taking the creative liberty to enhance the story and improve on tropes that we've seen before, it decided to follow them as was done in the past. There were also elements within the film that, from an outsider perspective, widened the gap and created a disconnect as opposed to building immersion. Dune is not a bad film, and many fans of the franchise will say it's the greatest science fiction film we've ever seen. I did enjoy it, and hope we get more productions like it in the future. But that doesn't mean we can't critique and learn from mistakes as well as missed opportunities. We need to remember that characters are the reason our audience feels connected to what is happening. Characters determine the tension and are the source of emotional resonance, allowing the writers to hammer home strong themes and ideas. When it comes to Dune and looking at what we should take away from this film, we should remember that tropes are effective, but overused and tired tropes should be reinvented rather than rehashed.